Emergency webinar discusses impact of Bill 223 on safe injection sites and harm reduction services. Welcome to Regent Park TV. Today we bring you a critical update on Bill 223 and its implications for harm reduction services in Ontario. On December 2nd, 2024, a special emergency webinar was hosted by the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society, Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction, and the Harm Reduction Advocacy Collective. The session brought together experts from the HIV Legal Network, Moss Park CTS, and Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction to discuss the legal complexities surrounding Bill 223 and its potential impact on communities across Toronto, including downtown east neighborhoods. The webinar focused on the legislation's threats to supervised consumption sites and other harm reduction services, with speakers addressing the current status of Bill 223 and providing a platform for community members to ask important questions. As harm reduction advocates continue to sound the alarm about the potential loss of these critical services, the webinar highlighted the urgency for public engagement and action to protect those most at risk in our communities. Now, let's take a closer look at the webinar and hear from the voices leading the change for harm reduction in Toronto.
We will be doing an overview of what's currently happening and with Bill 223, an act to amend acts of acts. It almost sounds like a tragedy, a Greek tragedy kind of is. And so we will be discussing that. So my name is Zoe Dodd. I'm from the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society. We will be hearing from Bree Olson and Musquasan Agnew from the Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction Network, Heather and Seth, who are currently at Moss Park at the CTS, Sandrika Honchu, and Cecile, I should know how to say your last name and I don't want to butcher it, from the HIV AIDS Legal Network, and Lorraine Lamb is here to be doing the tech support and monitoring the question and answers. Right now, the bill is just past its second vote in the House. And it went into second reading today, and just want to give a big shout out to Musquasan, who was there today disrupting the legislature during question period. For the last 2 weeks, people from the Harm Reduction Action Collective and the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society and the Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction Network and people affiliated have been in the legislature disrupting disrupting Queen's Park. So big shout out to everyone who's been doing that. It's important for us to keep the pressure on and this in the media. Okay, so I'm going to pass this off to Bree, who's going to get us open. So thank you.
Naha miigwech nimashomis gibawashayazin in nongom miigwech indicate nongom gishgad miigwech gaesh gakmakwe miigwech madswin miigwech no sewin sema nabagdana nadamushin jamishko gaboyan minwa jizogideyan. So basically I said thank you, Creator, for shining on us today, and to Grandfather Son, thank you for this gift of life, and thank you for the breath that we have every single day. Thank you. I would like to offer my tobacco to the four directions and ask for strength to stand with a strong heart and a strong mind. So, Nimigwech, I would like to just say that it's a critical time for safe consumption sites and the people behind them in this province and city. Take the time to get to know the sites, to honor the people who have passed to this toxic drug crisis, and to honor those fighting for the living and fighting for their lives. Harm reduction is sacred. Nahau, miigwech.
Miigwech, Bree. This is a critical time. We have 23 sites in the province of Ontario. We have urgent public health needs sites, which are, primarily in shelters. There has been a lot of misinformation. Things have happened so quickly. We have a current government that takes no responsibility. And we know that closing supervised consumption sites will send things into chaos, that people will die. And we are hearing consistently messaging from the Ontario government, especially Sylvia Jones, that no one will die after the closure of supervised consumption sites. So we do know in August the the government announced the closure. So they ignored the reviews that were done of South Riverdale Community Health Center and other reviews of supervised consumption services, which actually just gave them information of how to make things better in the CTS and the SESs. They didn't say anything about closing them, so the government chose to ignore this. And in August, they actually gave organizations letters to defund them. So we've been waiting for the legislation to come, but in the meantime, those letters arrived, and there was a lot of confusion as to what that means exactly. So already the sites that the 10 slated that the government said were closing, they had already received these letters to say, you got to come up with your wind down plans. You got to tell us how you're going to do that. You can apply for what's called a heart hub. And we don't, there's been so much misinformation. And what we want to do here today is provide accurate information. Look, the heart hubs are smoke and mirrors. They will not replace harm reduction. They're not even allowing harm reduction. They will not address the toxic drug death crisis that we're in or toxic drugs. None of that will be solved by whatever the heart hub is. And they haven't received letters to say who's even opening them. So if they were to open, or when they are to open, they will not be opening at the same time that the supervised consumption sites wind down. That's an impossibility as someone who has run programs and helped to open things up. It takes a very long time to get staffing and all of the things. It is essentially a drop-in program to help people navigate homelessness, and we don't have any housing. So organizations still don't understand if they'll be able to do needle exchange. And we're seeing huge increases of HIV rates in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. Alberta yesterday, it was in the news for World AIDS Day, talking about about HIV rates doubling and then tripling. And that actually, there is a correlation between that and injection drug use. And, when we fought for supervised consumption sites, it was about HIV and Hep C. Overdoses were not that common, and the toxic drug supply really made us have to change and pivot what we were doing. And so that's where the whole overdose prevention site came from. Moss Park overdose prevention site, which ran illegally in a park, was the first overdose prevention site in Ontario. And it was created to show the government and everyone else that you could easily open something up, that you didn't have to spend 6 years writing policies to open something and save people's lives. And now these are under threat of being closed. And we're going to hear all of the different ways that the government has found loopholes to try and close these sites. And we're doing this because knowledge has power. And we believe that educating people on what is happening is one of the best tools we have right now. That, we need to fight back, that we need to fight back collectively. And many of us did not go into this when these announcements were saying, oh, we're defeated, this is the end of it. No, fuck no. We are here to fight, we are here to organize, because these are our people. There are many people who it's themselves that use the sites, that these sites are as love, it's safety, it's everything, it's community, it's connection, it does good work. And so that's what we're hoping today, is to give you that education to get you fired up to fight as well. And yeah, so the bill has entered into the legislature a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to hear from Sandra and Cecile about where the bill is, what this legislation looks like, the legalities of it. We can't get into too many details about challenges to that, but I just want to assure people that obviously is being looked at and underway. So that much we can tell you. But maybe I'll hand it to Sandra and Cecile.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And I think we're just going to go over the bill itself. And I also wanted to start by saying I don't think that this is obviously a playbook from Alberta, and we caught wind of legislation in Quebec as well. This is going to infect the rest of the country if we don't stop it here in Ontario. And so I think it's really imploring everyone to be brave and bold as we do this work. So as you know, the bill was introduced 2 Mondays ago. It's called the Safe Streets and Stronger Communities Act, which is offensive, I think, because it makes everyone unsafe. And then the schedule that is involved, there's a bunch of aspects of this bill. It's an omnibus bill, like Zoe said, and there's other problematic aspects of it. But the part that relates to supervised consumption services is Schedule 4, and it's called something also Community Care and Recovery Act. So that's a Schedule 4 of the bill, and that's what we're mostly interested in. So if you go through the bill, Cecile, do you mind popping in the chat so people can take a look at the bill if they want to sort of follow along? The bill itself has a few different provisions. It's pretty short, the schedule, not the bill, the schedule itself is pretty short. And it defines, it says mainly, I would break it into two parts. That's how I conceptualize it. The first part says you can't operate, no one, be it your privately funded site, a government funded site, a municipally funded site, can operate your CTS within, or supervised consumption service, within 200 meters of a school, a childcare center, or any other designated premise. Okay, so that's the first part of the bill. And they also added, in the beginning, they said schools and childcare centers, and we learned last week they added early on centers, which could implicate other sites in the future. And also, very importantly, designated premise is undefined. So it could be defined later in the regulations by the government if they decided we're going to make playgrounds or some other site. We want to close down other sites, which is surely their long-term game plan. So they kept it open-ended. Right now, it's childcare centers, schools, and early on centers. And designated premise are not defined. So within 200 meters, and the important thing to remember is it doesn't matter if you're provincially funded or not, you're all affected. That includes UPHNS in shelters, that includes all sites. The second part that I think is important is the part that makes it, that prohibits municipalities or local boards, which could include a board of health, from requesting from the federal government an exemption. So generally to get, I think most of the site operators, to get an exemption to operate without risk of criminal prosecution, you need a 56.1 or sometimes a 56 subsection 1 exemption from the drug law, the federal drug law. So you can operate without being prosecuted for simple possession or sometimes trafficking. And so it stops municipalities and local boards from requesting that exemption to operate their own site. So, in Toronto, for example, the Works is operating a site as a municipality. In Ottawa, there's a site that's municipally funded and operated. And I think there's one in Kitchener. So those municipalities or local boards of health can no longer ask for a federal exemption to operate their own site. And they can't also ask for an exemption to decriminalize simple drug possession like Toronto did a few years ago. Some of you might remember back in maybe 3-4 years ago, Toronto tried. They requested an exemption to decriminalize simple possession, and they can't partake in safe supply programs. So that's a second part of the problematic legislation. When this bill passed, Zoe just mentioned it's the second reading right now today, I think this afternoon. Whenever it passed,
it already went past the second reading. They had a vote already.
Yeah. Okay. So it's imminent. This piece of the legislation, when this law gets royal assent, which is when it becomes law, this part of the law that says municipalities and local boards can't ask for a federal exemption is effective immediately. The 200-meter rule that I just mentioned is effective April 1st. That's why they gave the wind down plans for end of March. So that part, April 1st, this part effective right away. So that means municipalities and boards of health can no longer request the exemption. The other piece of that legislation also says they can't support any other person's exemption. And the way they defined it is very broad. I think the actual language is the municipalities can no longer, let me just find it, support, including by passing a bylaw or making a resolution, an application to Health Canada for an exemption. And right now we know that I understand the practices that most supervised consumption services, when they're getting the exemption, don't need a letter of support right now from the municipality. But in the early days, I think many of you did need that. So depending on what happens federally, like we have a new federal government that is hell-bent on shutting them down, they might say mandatory, you get a letter of support from municipality. This legislation says the municipalities can no longer do that, and that's effective immediately. And it's the way it's described is so vague. It could mean the way Cecile and I have conceptualized it could mean maybe money to support an SES. It could mean in-kind support for an SES. We don't know what it means. It hasn't been tested in a court, but there's lots of ways that municipalities support supervised consumption services. So if it's interpreted really broadly by the Ontario government, that also, I think, is an intentional drafting. That means that if they decide these 7 remaining sites, we want to shut them down, or all the other sites, they can very easily do that if they say that's a form of municipal support, and also we're going to make designated premise like anything. They could designate anything in the future. Sorry, UPHNS. Thank you, Lorraine, for defining what that means. And then maybe I'll pass it over to Cecile. Is there anything that you want to add in terms of the bill itself?
Thanks, Sandra. I mean, if people have questions, we can maybe answer those, but just maybe very concretely. So as Zoe said, there is a number of SES right now in Ontario, and the concrete impact of the bill will be that at least 10 of the currently operating supervised consumption services would close in Ontario. Many are based in Toronto, and also the temporary UPHNS, which are the urgent public health needs services that may be located in shelters, like the overdose prevention services that are low threshold, could also be forced to close if they are located within this 200-meter limits. So this bill is really a way to make it impossible to continue operating or opening new sites, continue operating for those that are, of course, within these 200 meters. That's for sure. That applies to every site that are within these parameters. But it's also jeopardize other sites, as Sandra explained, because it will be if a site is actually managed by a municipality, or if a new site were to be managed by a municipality, that would no longer be possible for them to apply for an exemption. So it really prevents also like city municipalities from stepping in to open new sites or to provide support, and maybe in terms of funding for those that may no longer receive money from the provincial government.
Yeah. And it just reminded me of something. It also doesn't matter if your site was there first. If a daycare opens up there later, your site has to close. That's the way the legislation's drafted. So we had a question here about the exemption. And so the exemption, so the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act has provisions that make it a crime to have drugs for your own use, or to even split and share drugs, a trafficking offense. So that's why when the sites operate, they ask the feds, they say, can we get permission, an exemption to operate, so our clients and sometimes staff, if they're, I don't know if staff usually, the court said, Supreme Court of Canada said staff aren't implicated, but for clients aren't criminally vulnerable to arrest if they're like using their drugs or splitting or sharing their drugs in some cases, depending on the exemption. So that's how they act as sort of like a bubble against criminalization. That's what the exemption is. And that's a power that the feds have. But the province here is saying, you can't even ask the feds for that. You need to ask us for approval first. And Sylvia Jones has been very clear that she's not going to approve or fund future sites. Like that has been the direction that they're going. So that's what a federal exemption is. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, I think maybe it's good to talk about the CDSA, like where that exemption comes from, so people understand. It's been so long that we've had to talk about the exemption process, because we've been running supervised consumption sites for 20
Yeah.
years in Canada,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we actually would love to eliminate the CDSA at some point as one of the solutions to all of this.
Yes, and actually, yes, absolutely. Has, like you said, super racist roots. And the CDSA, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, is a federal law that applies across the country. So whether you're in BC or Ontario, Alberta, it's the same law. And there's a section in the CDSA called the Section 56, subsection 1, and subsection 56.1. I know it sounds, I can put in the chat. There's 56.1 is the specific exemption that people need to get for supervised consumption services. And then UPHNS, which I know was explained in the chat, are sometimes the route for 56 subsection 1 exemptions. It depends, and different provinces also have provincial class exemptions. But in Ontario, I think the bulk of the sites get a 56.1 exemption. And the federal government will say, hey, we need you to comply with certain things. And in the past, I think it was like community consultation. Cecile, maybe you can speak better to this, but there were a number of conditions that they had to fulfill. And I know there's been increasing flexibility over the last few years, and that's why we've seen some increase in sites. It's separate from the provincial CTS. So provincial CTS is a funding stream. Like it's also, you have to comply with the province's requirements to get money to operate your site. So first you get the federal exemption. The federal exemption often requires you to have funding already sort of guaranteed or assured from the province. And the province will have its own conditions, which are much higher barrier, I understand, than the federal exemption process. Like the provincial process requires a number of different things, which I'm sure other people on this call can speak more to. So there's separate processes. You see a federal one to get, so your clients just don't get arrested. And the provincial one is just to get funding for your site. Cecile, is there anything to add about the distinction between federal and provincial?
No, I think you summarized it very clearly. Maybe just to highlight that indeed, when the Conservatives were in power at the federal level, they really made the legislation very strict. So it made it very difficult to actually get and in fact, impossible to get an exemption at the federal level to be able to even just be allowed to operate supervised consumption services. And in recent years, actually, the law has changed, and at the federal level, there were like more flexibility, and this is why we've seen an expansion of supervised consumption services in across the country. But then we've seen backlash at the provincial level, and the province is in charge of healthcare, and this is why they are the one that are funding the site, and so they are using the power around the funding to actually regulate and limit and impose new barriers to supervised consumption services. So it's really frustrating because you make progress at one level and then you're barred at another level. And right now with the new bill, if you want to at least get the city to maybe support you because you're blocked at the provincial level to get funding, or then you're blocked again because the province is saying no, we're going to control even what the municipality is going to do.
Yeah, and I think why we wanted to do this webinar is because, initially what they were saying was oh, they can't be close to schools, that the zoning, and I know someone put in the chat, does that come from colleges and universities? I mean, this is the thing, we don't know. They are probably not, but we don't know. There's so many loopholes that they've thought of, the thing around municipalities, the thing around zoning, the adding to the zoning, and the bill was voted in second reading today. And so how a bill works usually is it gets introduced, then there's a first reading, then there's a second reading, then there is room to have comments and amendments, and then the third reading, and it passes and it gets royal assent. So the way that what the government has done here is removed any possibility for public comment or any expert comment on the bill. So the bill itself has lots of other problematic areas besides just this specific section, and there's no amendments allowed on the bill. And so this is also a very draconian, authoritarian way of moving a bill through that's extremely anti-democratic and will have massive repercussions. So, they're also talking about, and people saw the news today, just the amount of emergency room closures this year alone, that there's hospitals that are closing, emergency departments that that they couldn't even open their doors. And so we know, because we're in a toxic drug death crisis and a toxic drug crisis, that more there will be more paramedic calls and more people trying to get to emergency departments, and those emergency departments may not even be open. Sandra?
Sorry, I just want to clarify the school question, because school is currently defined in the Education Act as elementary and secondary schools for the moment. But I think what you said and what the person said in the chat, designated premise is undefined. So we don't know, in the future, they could definitely say something else. But for the moment, it's secondary and elementary schools. Could I touch just quickly on the potential for a legal challenge? So as Zoe said, things are underway. There's conversations happening in community about a potential legal challenge. And again, the way I broke it up in those two chunks before, there's a 200-meter prohibition, which I think is, in my view, the easier piece to challenge, because there's some commentary from the Ontario Human Rights Commission about zoning and how zoning in certain respects, like zoning people out of spaces, is discriminatory. You could argue that it's contravening the charter in terms of depriving people of access to essential health care, which this decision of the Supreme Court of Canada called Insight, PHS versus the Attorney General, this is a BC case from 2011, the Supreme Court recognized at the time that's essential healthcare. It saves people's lives, supervised consumption services, and depriving people of access to it is a violation of the charter. The second chunk is about prohibiting municipalities, and it would be really, I think that would be really important to have a municipality or a local board of health step up and also challenge that part of the legislation, because they are the body that is directly affected by this piece that says they can't do the thing that they should be doing and actually responding to the needs of community. And so I think, again, the first piece, the 200-meter prohibition, it seems like a fairly straightforward. Any CTS could challenge that if they're affected by it, any of the 10 or maybe even the UPHNS. But the second piece really does require a board of health or a municipality to come forward. And I know there's a lot of concerns about doing that because people also receive a lot of provincial funding and it could affect other services. But that is a piece that is much harder to challenge without some city or board of health being there.
So basically, if you're on this call and you want to push to do legal stuff and you're a person maybe using a service, we'd love to hear from you. Because right now, a lot of organizations, I think, got really cold feet right at the beginning, worried about all of their funding dollars. And the reality is, not one site can be spared. So I know in the chat it said someone asking about Toronto. There are sites that have their exemptions up for renewal. So South Riverdale Community Health Center was one of those sites. They would normally get a 3-year exemption. They heard last minute that their exemption was renewed, but until March 31st, 2025. So even the federal government is playing along with the provincial government's bullshit. And I think that we should be really clear of where the federal government is standing on this issue when they do shit like that. And then, because the legislation has not even passed yet. And so that's for those. And so really, we would basically be left with one, which would be Casey House, which is inaccessible because it's not open to the public. And even if other sites were left open, the ones that would be left they got their exemption renewed for longer, they're smaller sites. And so there's a lot of other rules that the government has made stipulations for sites that are operating, which would be that they would have to comply with no loitering, with all these other things, which was essentially put them in a hot seat and get them closed down anyway. So if you have a site that only has 2 or 3 booths and has limited capacity and hours, and you have a long lineup outside, there's a complaint process that neighbors and others can enter. And since this is about the government saying, I've talked to people, they don't want them in my neighborhood, and that's the way that they're deciding to close them down, you can just imagine where that would head to. So also there's something about the drug checking. And so yes, drug checking, it would be, we're also really worried about the drug checking programs and them also not being able to operate. They also operate they also operate in the supervised consumption sites, they actually operate in tandem with them. So this is also something we're worried about losing. Drug checking services are really important for us, knowing what the drug supply is like and what's happening to people. It's a very timely way to determine when you have new drugs on the scene, what it is that's causing the overdoses. There was a question also about gear and harm reduction supplies, and this is something that groups of us have been talking about because we are unsure what any of it means and have not been able to get real responses from the Ministry of Health. And so I don't know, Sandra, if you know anything about whether organizations, if they get municipal funding, so say in Toronto, we had a conversation about this the other day. In Toronto, our supplies come from Toronto Public Health to supervised consumption services. If organizations aren't supposed to be taking any municipal funding or municipal whatever, would that include the works or us receiving needle exchange supplies?
That's a question we don't know because of the vagueness of the drafting. So I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe it's for the site itself. I mean, that's the way I interpret it, but obviously I can't get into the minds of the drafters. Like, we just don't know how it affects. Like, if you are operating the CTS site and you get some funding from the municipality because you're also doing other stuff, it depends on how they decide to read it. So I don't know that we have a clear answer.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing, just to highlight before we move on, is that there is funding for the UPHNSs in the shelters. And so we know that there was like a huge spike in an increase in shelter deaths within the shelters. There's reports that came out by Tara Gomes that I also helped with, and evaluations of the shelter system. There's been a reduction in some of those deaths because of implementation of supervised consumption services known as UPHNS in shelters like St. Felix's shelter, Liberty Street, and in the Bond and elsewhere. Oh yeah, and 545 Lakeshore. And so those have become really essential services for people's survival. Those will also be at risk, and if they receive city funding, they would also be at risk. So they've really thought about every single thing that they could do to make us believe that it would be 10 sites only. It's not the case. Okay, do we have any more questions that I missed? Did I miss anything, Lorraine?
Yeah, there's a couple here. So one question.
And we're going to have 15 minutes at the end too, hopefully, or 10 minutes or something. So
there's a question here just around the procedure that the government is trying to push it through. There's a question whether or not the province is looking at using the notwithstanding clause if the bill is challenged. Do we know?
I think that's hard to predict, but they've done it before. They had a bill that was struck down by Superior Court on the basis that it was a violation of the charter. Sorry, maybe just explain what the notwithstanding clause is first. The notwithstanding clause is a section in our charter, our constitution, that says even if you're violating the certain sections of the charter, which include section 7, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, or section 15, which is right not to be discriminated against, notwithstanding that you're violating those sections of the charter, this you can still go ahead with your law. And so it's been invoked in Quebec with language laws. It's been invoked in Quebec with the religious symbol legislation. It's been invoked, I think, threatened to be invoked in Alberta with like gender affirming education. So, and it's rarely invoked. But this government, Ontario, I think under Ford has done it 2 or 3 times before. It's the first time ever the provincial government did it. It was under this provincial government. And so there was another bill that around election financing some years ago, where Superior Court said, hey, this is a violation of a section of the charter, and the government came back, invoked notwithstanding, which is section 33 of the charter, and said, notwithstanding that we are violating X of the charter, they can pass the bill, and you can do that for up to 5 years and keep renewing. I understood from a colleague in Quebec that Quebec often renews their notwithstanding clause exemptions in their bills. So after 5 years, the Ford government, if it's still in power, could keep, presumably, renewing a notwithstanding. So there was a worry at the time when we heard the August announcement, because there was actually global news article that came out 2 weeks ago that some of you might have seen, where the government's own lawyers said, this bill will likely violate the charter. And so knowing that the government gave them this advice internally, our thinking was like they would have done something. Like I was thinking it was a great possibility that they would invoke it notwithstanding, but they haven't done that so far. I don't think that precludes them from doing it if the Superior Court in Ontario decides, if there's a case and the judge says, hey, this is a violation of sections 7 of the charters, 15 of the charter, the ones I just mentioned, that they could come back and reintroduce the bill word for word and invoke the notwithstanding clause. In which case it makes it much harder to challenge. But I know there's some lawyers across the country that are just sort of thinking of novel ways to challenge a notwithstanding clause bill. I don't know how effective they'll be, but that that was a risk.
Thank you. And there's a question here related to exemptions. So Fred Victor and Street Health's exemptions expire February and March 2025. They are not municipally run, but will their renewals also be interfered with and blocked by the province based on how you're interpreting the bill?
Cecile, do you want to take that one? I think you've been.
Yeah, I'll be cautious first because we can't provide legal advice, and also I'm not sure I have all the information on like how they operate, etc. My gut instinct would be that if they are not within the 200 meters, they should not have an issue with the bill. And if they do not need municipal support, then they should be fine too. I think the big concern is around the funding. So if you need provincial funding, because at some point it's impossible to operate without, then you will be blocked. But it's not going to be because of this bill unless you wanted to get some funding from the municipality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think our understanding is that you have to get a provincial approval for your exemption renewal. So if you get federal exemption renewal, then you need to get provincial exemption renewal. But that's the thing that we don't understand, because like even without the legislation, they already defunded the sites that they slated to close before the legislation even appeared. And so I think for most of us, our feeling, especially after the feds just gave South Riverdale their exemption renewal only until March 2025 and not for 3 years like they normally do, that the fear is that the province would say no to someone's exemption renewal and that you would not be able to operate. That you need both province and feds, just like how now for SUAP funding, if you want to apply for SUAP funding to have a safe supply program or any safe SUAP funding, you have to go through the province for approval first. And that would be another way for them to limit our ability to do any harm reduction work as well. They could say, well, we don't agree with this funding proposal, and it wouldn't go through.
Well, Sandra can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that if it's not municipally run, or if you don't seek the support of the municipality, then this particular bill doesn't require you to get approval from the provincial government to apply for a new exemption. But then, as Sandra explained, the feds may be, not keen to provide an exemption if they do not have, if the site cannot secure funding for it. So it's a kind of a vicious circle at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But it would not be the bill specifically, as I understand it.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to move on. There's probably lots of questions. This is obviously good that we're doing this. We could do this again. And I'm going to ask Bria Musquassen to talk now. Thanks.
Miigwech. So I'm going to preface what Musquassen will share just with some historical context. So I'm inviting you all to look at the devastating governmental policies and take a more critical look at the institutions we see as permanent fixtures. Why right here in so-called Toronto, we rarely hear about the Neutral, a tribe of 40,000 Indigenous people whose thriving society died off as a result of famine and diseases post-colonization, whose murders made way for the settlement of the city that we reside in. How the Industrial Revolution, which saw the slaughter of millions of bison across Turtle Island, whose hides created belts for factories in Europe, a slaughter that also meant the deliberate starvation and murder of Indigenous people across this country, made way for railways and forts that are major cities today. On top of this so-called revolution, we saw another industry emerge in which those who could not join the workforce as productive or normal were relegated to either death or institutionalization. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, a single-digit number of asylums existed across Turtle Island, which quickly exploded into hundreds of asylums who practiced what they called moral treatments. These very asylums and hospitals were responsible for the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous people for centuries, an arm of the residential school industrial complex, which is not formally recognized by Canada, even today. How akin are these moral treatments to policies that we see before us? These institutions, an offshoot of the industrial age and the birthplace of eugenics whose legacy lives on today. Broad institutionalization and the disparities it created wasn't a sad byproduct of advancement in society. It's rather an intentional system of displacement, medical neglect, and death, evident in the continued genocide of Indigenous peoples here today. And remember that today we cannot blindly or apolitically follow the policies set before us, but must rigorously defend the rights to dignified healthcare and harm reduction for those with the least power and who are most oppressed, for the benefit of all of our kin. Instead, we see a government that intentionally withholds life-saving care and exposes people to illness or preventable death through widespread medical neglect. This is a history we cannot turn or shy from, nor it is a reality we can tolerate today. Consider for a moment that even today, Indigenous people's health is being dictated, drafted into policy, and policed without any thought for constitutional rights, without consultation, prior or informed consent. Same today as it was for my parents and grandparents. Despite every perceived advancement, our people become fodder for the prison system and forced treatment, a modern iteration of the asylum system, more than any other group of people. We are the canary in the coal mine, and if you want to see the state of your rights, simply look a little further to find the erosion of ours. We owe it to trailblazers and now ancestors like Murray Sinclair, fighting the nation-state of Canada in their own courts alongside residential school survivors who created the TRC calls to action, which sadly our governments all across this country continue to fail to meet. And where do we see ourselves today in the current drug poisoning crisis, in which a human being dies every 2 hours in this province? We have politicians who will look you directly in the eye and withdraw basic health care and life-saving measures and tell you it is for your benefit. People still facing abuse and lack of basic rights while living with HIV, AIDS, or hepatitis. They might criminalize you for camping outside if you're Indigenous, or place you in jail for not having a home. Tell you that no lives will be lost with their policy cuts, even when we see our relatives and friends continue to die preventable and traumatic deaths. It is a frightening time, but not a time that we have not experienced as Indigenous people. In fact, the most extreme acts of inhumanity we see today in policy and practice are rooted in the colonization of Indigenous peoples and our lands. There is no coincidence that Indigenous people make up a large demographic of those who access safe consumption sites, that opioid-related deaths are 7 times higher for First Nations people, and that drug poisoning deaths are much higher and increasing more rapidly for our people. Similarly, the omnibus bill that we see before us is eerily similar to the Harper's omnibus bill that stripped environmental protections all across this country and led to the Idle No More movement. Your lives are up for debate, relegated to institutions, policies, debate, and polarization. Your health, relationships, and survival are a bill on the table. And this is truer than ever for people who are trans, queer, substance users, Black or Indigenous, racialized, or homeless. I remember hearing from doctors time and time again that the greatest risk to public health is stigma. I learned from harm reduction champion Susan Boyd that by and large, poverty and lack of access to healthcare is the largest predictor of quality of life, not that someone is a substance user. How then can we move towards liberation, dignity, and freedom while holding on to and confronting these realities? Now, miigwech, and I'll pass it on to Ms. Gwasson.
Hello, my name is Ms. Gwasson. I'm a member of Salt River First Nation. I am a resident here in Toronto, and I also work with Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction. As you heard this morning, I was at Queen's Park disrupting and calling attention to Bill 223. And I had chosen to disrupt while the government was talking about residential school survivors. And Sol Mamakwa was calling attention to the fact that we're digging up our ancestors right now. And you know, when we talk about the ongoing and continued genocide of Indigenous people, it's right here in this bill. Indigenous people are the #1 service users of safe consumption sites, and we are also overrepresented among drug users who have passed on from the opiate drug supply and toxic drug supply. So I work in OPS, and I can tell you that the one that I work at is small, and we have lots of Indigenous women that come in and access our site. And I also do street outreach, and I work directly here in Toronto with Indigenous people who use drugs every day. And I can tell you that I'm going to see people die, and it will be our community. And this is not we are not a byproduct or an accident. This is very intentional. This is you know, the ongoing genocide of our people, and that's what I said in the legislature this morning. And you know, I think that it's very telling that they've pushed through the second reading of this bill, because they're cowards and they're ashamed, and they know that they have done no consultation with our communities, and it's actually their responsibility to consult us on the health and self-determination in our healthcare. And once again, this has been ignored. And so what we're going to see is an increase of Indigenous people and other racialized people pay the price for this bill. And it's going to, you know, this is going to have its ripple effects in our community. And when we think about, for me, really, when this bill is structured around safety, and I'd like to ask the question, the safety of whom? Because you know, when we think about missing murdered Indigenous women, when we look at our toxic drug supply, and we know that our people are out there on the streets completely incapacitated and the most vulnerable that they could ever possibly be, it's only within safe consumption sites that they receive the safety and supports that they need. And you know, we're going to see our people, we're going to see more public drug use than we ever have. And it's not just Toronto, we're thinking Ontario wide. And so it's not going to just be an increase of overdose deaths, but an increase of threat to safety of in many ways, in different capacities. So you know, I think of our community, and it's this is setting a precedent for how bills are going to be passed, and how laws are going to be structured. We're seeing that the Board of Health, Toronto Police Services are partnering even in the downtown core right now, and policing people. And really, again, I'd like to ask people to think about what public safety is and what that means. And so even with this bill, we're also seeing that they're trying to make amendments to the Mental Health Act, and how they clear encampments, and et cetera, and et cetera. So this is a really dangerous trend that's starting, and this bill is just the first of many tragedies to come. Thank you.
Yeah, we're in extremely troubling times, and I think when people talk about fascism rising and these, like, it sounds so extreme. It's like, well, what kind of situation are we living in where bills can just be passed like this? And not, and also to take into consideration the notwithstanding clause trying to be used for encampment sweeps, and then the involuntary treatment, which will just look at incarcerating people as the government builds private prisons and starts talking about cells being therapeutic rooms when they're actual cages. I'm going to go to Heather and Seth. Also, I just wanted to clarify, I did say that the exemption for South Riverdale is March 31st, 2025. The problem with South Riverdale is it's zoned next to school and childcare center, so that is why. But it is also just thinking of the other sites of whether the government would actually fund them or not, or choose not to. Because without legislation, they chose not to. So up next is Heather and Seth from the Moss Park site.
Thanks, Zoe. Hey, I'm Seth. I use they, them pronouns.
I'm Heather. How you going?
Yeah. So we're here to talk about the overarching impact of this bill. And at Moss Park Consumption and Treatment Service, we are slated to close even though we're not affected by the 200-meter ban. It's because our lease is ending. So because the entire block that Moss Park is located on is being bought out by condo developers, we have been told by the province that any kind of an application we put forward for a relocation would be considered as a brand new application, which they would deny. So this has really overarching impacts across the city. I think a number of folks in the chat have brought these points up, that a lot more sites are affected by this legislation than are being talked about in the media. And we know the implications that this has on folks who use the sites. We have more than 200 unique individuals accessing services at Moss Park each and every month. We have holistic wraparound healthcare services offered to folks, and a proven model that's been working since 2018. So I'll pass it to Heather to talk a bit about some of the realities.
So the realities are, we're kind of in a mad scramble with no answers of what we're going to do with our community. The reality is, because of the drug supply being extra toxic, we're dealing with the same people overdosing daily. Also, new wild overdoses that we're innovating of how to respond to, as far as them putting anesthetic in it now, so the heart rates are dropping. It's becoming wintertime, and the community knows what's going on despite all the rumors and confusion. So we're still trying to, like, with the confusion ourselves, to decide what we're going to say and how we're going to find some kind of wraparound healthcare for people in 4 months with very little answers. It's like pretty tension, and yeah.
Yeah, it's been really difficult, I think, just the amount of grief and loss that folks in our communities have experienced. And then compounding on top of that is this uncertainty, not knowing if the service is going to be open moving forward, not knowing what's going to happen or where they can go, and really highlighting the points that folks have already made. You know, services have been told to come up with transition plans, but to where? There are no other comparable services that are being offered after these ones are forced to close. So this is a demographic of folks who are not going to have a safe place to go use. They're not going to be able to access overdose response services. And, you know, this is something we fought hard for in 2017, seeing the uptick of the toxic drug supply, and we are still in a very complicated position now.
Yeah, and I reckon once everything's closed and all of the, you know, police, emergency healthcare services are overwhelmed, we will then become the scapegoat for that as well. So buckle up, yeah.
A lot of what we're doing for contingency planning is emergency preparedness. So we're trying to train community members and folks around us in overdose response and trauma-informed interventions, but we're also anticipating this huge amount of grief and loss and lack of access to services. So really
And confusion, bad confusion right now.
Yeah. Pass it back to you, Zoe. Thank you.
It's just so fucked up, and it's like hard to wrap our brains around, I think our collective brains around the fuckery of this and how cruel this is and where this is headed. But we're a lot of grassroots organizers here too, and so we know that in the face of state violence and neglect and abandonment, that we have to organize, and we need other people in solidarity to organize together. And we are in unprecedented times. I've never personally seen a bill like this without people being able to comment on it or for amendments like this. And there's a few questions in the chat. One is about, like, will people who are trained be allowed to use oxygen, for example? So yeah, like drop-ins and other places, libraries, there's going to be so many places where people will overdose. I think there is a fear that we need like emergency mass casualty planning to happen. I mean, it's like, one, we need to fight against this, but two, we need to be real that we saw during COVID, even with the works closing, in those weeks that it closed and the reduction in occupancy, we saw so many people overdosing and dying outside here in Toronto. Like, it was scary and fucked up. And so maybe, yeah, we might not be able to get to the oxygen question because I don't know, that's up to the organizations. You got to get medical directives. But there's a question around, like, can we take this to the Supreme Court? Could this be legally challenged? And then we're going to give you a couple, and about the Fed. So look, the Fed's not really pushing back. No, I would say that Yara Sack's been put on this file because she's kind of incompetent. And that she's just like someone to like be like, oh, yeah, okay, well, you know, it's just like They've been so incompetent. They've not stuck up for this at all. We do not have emergency tables in this province. We do not have an emergency table at the federal level that actually like addresses these things, despite what they want to say. They don't. And so would I say the feds are pushing? No. Have we heard from them? No. Have Health Canada been silent? Yes. On a provincial level, there are people working within these institutions and ministries that could speak up. They could walk out. They could leave their jobs. They could have some integrity to not send emails out telling people to wind down. That's my opinion, but I have a lot of integrity. I would quit my job personally. And there are, so there are always going to be those people, those bureaucrats that are part of making these decisions. Maybe other people don't agree, but I don't think that we all just can be so neutral about things, because making those decisions is not neutrality. And I would suggest that on a provincial level, the opposition is trying their best, but I would reach out to the NDP to get them to ask more questions on the floor. They also need to meet with people to actually hear what we know about the bills and what our research says, not just their researchers. And then on a grassroots level, there's places that need funding and money. So the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society is fundraising right now to pay for some stuff. So that would be helpful if you want to donate. Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction Network are out doing outreach. Please donate to them. They need funds to, like, they're seeing people outside. They need funds to help support people outside. Get involved. Marina's on here, maybe can speak to the Harm Reduction Action Coalition and what you're all doing. There's very little precedent around this, as Sandra says, like, I think around this particular, the Supreme Court fight with Insight. I don't know how that helps us here at this point. You'd think that it would be a reason not to pass a bill like this. Sandra, what do you think?
Sure. I mean, I would say it is a good case. It's from 13 years ago. I mean, the courts are inherently conservative. That's my view, and they're really not out to protect people who use drugs or other communities that we work and love. But they did acknowledge in Insight that it's a form of healthcare. And so when you're depriving people of access to a supervised consumption services, which is a form of healthcare, they said what the minister was doing at the time, a minister named Tony Clement, which some of you probably remember back in the day.
Hate that guy.
Yeah. And what he did was wrong. Like, his discretion was not exercised in a constitutional way, and they ordered him to grant the exemption. So I think that is a precedent that will be used if there's a legal challenge here, that you are depriving people of access to essential health care and that people will definitely die. And they recognize that in the court decision. So there is some precedent, I guess, in terms of harm reduction drug policy cases. There's not a hell of a lot of those cases, though. And courts are usually not our friends, in my perspective. But I think it's sort of the last resort here, because they're not listening to us in any other way.
Cape Mops and Street House, so the Kensington Market, OPS and Street Health were unfunded in 2018. They're still operating on donations. They really could use funds right now. So if you have funds to spare, or people who have money and want to donate, don't give it to CAMH. Give it to K-MOPS and Street Health. Like, stop giving it to these massive institutions for research. Would be a message I would share with other people. I fucking hate that shit. Okay, so Marina, do you want to talk about hack? Are you on?
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Yeah, first of all, I just want to follow up and say, like, I'm so impressed with the resistance that's going on right now, and with all of the people that have been showing up in every form, disrupting, throwing rallies, speaking to our people, coming out in the street. Like, this is amazing to see, and it's so powerful. And I think I just want to remind all of us that we don't respect unjust laws. If this passes, it doesn't change a thing. We continue to resist. And one of the ways that we resist is through grassroots movements. And Harm Reduction Advocacy Collective is meeting on a regular basis. Every Tuesday at College Street United Church, we have a meeting tomorrow night. And we are continuing to be a place that people can gather if they want to join in, especially if you are someone who is new to doing direct action. If you are new to doing advocacy for harm reduction, you are welcome. Come, please be a part of this movement. We are so powerful when we come together. And again, I'm plugging, like, please donate to these grassroots movements and to drug users that are doing incredible activism, because we are the people that take care of each other, right? We are the people that watch out for each other. And no matter what happens, no matter how this government decides to murder us, to murder drug users, to murder Indigenous people, to murder vulnerable people, we will continue. We will continue to fight. And there will always be a place for you to be supported and cared for. You are loved. Harm reduction is sacred. Harm reduction is powerful. And so I really just want to reiterate that the fight is not over, and please plug in, get involved. There are so many ways to show up. And so I'm sending love to all of you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're coming to the end. I just wanted to close it out with Bree. Is that right, Bree? You're down to do that? Leave you with the last words. Okay.
Yeah. Oh my God, last words, great.
The last but many words to go, because we have to keep doing this.
So yeah, I just want to challenge folks to, again, like, consider the context around the colonization, settler colonialism, and genocide. And we talk about, Ms. Gwasson mentioned, like, whose safety, and I think back to the nations here that were murdered through famine, through disease, and that was intentionally done for the safety of the settler population. And this is not a long time ago. The biggest push for settler colonialism in the city of Toronto happened in my parents' generation, within the 30s to the 70s, and that is a very recent history. And that this is just simply another iteration of that. So, when we're talking about reconciliation, it's a very lofty, ideology and thought, but it comes down to practice in spaces like these, and it challenges your values in the most fundamental ways. So I encourage folks to consider your role here in the city, and to consider your relationship to Indigenous people in the lens of harm reduction.
Hi. Okay, so thank you everyone for being on. We're gonna send out a recording of this because we know there's so much information. Big shout out to the people in other communities that joined us today who are fighting really hard for their spaces. We're thinking about you too. We don't just do this for the city. We do this work for everybody. And so, I know Guelph, Kitchener-Waterloo, Hamilton, Sudbury, all of you people are on here today. Big shout out to those in the north who are about to lose, and hopefully won't lose, their one site. I mean, we need to put the energy out there that we can win and we can not lose this battle. Okay, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.